On the 45th floor of Brighton Innovations, the boardroom gleamed with polished glass and chrome. Madison Cole stood at the head of the table, every detail of her red-tailored suit as sharp as her gaze. At 35, she had built a reputation for running meetings with precision, measuring worth in numbers and silence. The executives leaned forward as she flipped through slides of quarterly gains. Then the room jolted when a mop bucket sloshed water across the edge of the glass table. Ethan Walker, the janitor, froze for a moment, cloth in hand, his broad shoulders stiff as he tried to wipe away the spill before it spread. A ripple of laughter broke the boardroom tension. Madison's voice cut sharper than the glass around them as she told him to stick to the mop and leave innovation to the people who mattered. The laughter grew, echoing against the tall windows, and Ethan lowered his eyes, gathering his tools in silence. He left the room without protest, his dignity held tight in the quiet strength of his stride. Madison shifted her focus back to projections, ignoring the flush of shame that briefly touched her face. To the board, she looked untouchable, a woman carved from steel. Yet, beneath her icy confidence lay memories she rarely allowed surface. A childhood of empty hallways and unanswered questions. A father who drowned himself in work after her mother's sudden death. She had learned early that achievement filled the silence better than grief. Each promotion and headline had been armor against the loneliness she never admitted to anyone. Down in the maintenance wing, Ethan stacked his supplies neatly, the calluses on his hands catching against the handle of the mop. At 37, his life revolved around more than floors and windows. He carried responsibility heavier than the equipment he pushed every night. When his shift ended near 07:15 a.m., he drove his old truck back to a modest apartment where Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, waited with a book already open in her lap. She greeted him with a grin that erased the sting of humiliation. Sophie was small for her age, but sharp, reading chapters far ahead of her classmates. She asked him about math problems, about the world, about why some kids had more, while others had so little. He never had easy answers, but he always made sure she felt safe. In the evenings, when other children went home to bigger houses, Sophie accompanied him to Riverside Haven, the community shelter he supported quietly. She would hand out sandwiches with a smile, explaining to curious kids that their apartment was small because her dad was helping build something bigger than themselves. In that boardroom, Ethan was invisible, reduced to the mop in his hand. At the shelter, he was something else, the steady anchor holding a fragile community together. Madison wielded power in skyscrapers, but Ethan's influence glowed in the warmth of shared meals and borrowed books. The gap between them was more than wealth and title. It was two worlds on a collision course, one measured in profits and the other in sacrifice. The storm that would expose their true worth had not yet arrived, but the injustice already hung heavy in the air, daring the audience to wonder which strength would matter most when everything fell apart. Richard Hale arrived at the office before 08:00 a.m., his tie perfectly knotted, his steps echoing with purpose down the marble hallway of Brighton Innovations. At 48, the CFO had spent decades sharpening his craft until profit margins and stock projections were the only measures of value he recognized. That morning he stood before the executive team with a gleaming model of what he called the Innovation Hub, a billion-dollar development that would erase Riverside Block from the map. The neighborhood was old and crowded, filled with families, small businesses, and weathered apartment buildings. To Richard, it was nothing more than a line item, prime land that could be converted into glass towers and lucrative tax incentives. He spoke of return on investment, 300% in 5 years, while never once acknowledging the thousands of people who would be displaced. Ethan Walker stood outside the boardroom with a maintenance cart, listening through the glass. He had lived near Riverside his entire life, the shelter he ran after hours. Riverside Haven sat right in the middle of the demolition zone. every child who came through his doors, every elderly man who sat down for a hot meal, would lose more than a building. They would lose their community. But here in the skyscraper, their existence didn't even warrant a mention. Later that morning, Ethan found the courage to knock on Madison Cole's office door. She barely looked up from her tablet when he stepped inside. His voice was steady as he explained the warning lights he had seen on the backup power system in the basement. The generators were old and showing critical wear. If the city faced a major storm, the entire building could lose power. Madison waved him off, reminding him that engineers handled technical issues, not janitors. She told him to focus on cleaning and not infrastructure. Richard Hale happened to be passing by and stopped to listen. He smirked as Madison dismissed Ethan's concerns and added his own sting, telling him that no one wanted a janitor pretending to be an engineer. He stamped the report low priority, red ink bleeding across Ethan's careful handwriting. Laughter from a few junior analysts followed Ethan back down the hall as he pushed his cart in silence, his jaw tight, his pride wounded but not broken. That evening, long after the city lights flickered on, Ethan parked his old pickup outside Riverside Haven. Inside, nearly 50 people waited for dinner. Children rushed toward him with wide smiles. Mothers with tired eyes sighed in relief as he entered. He rolled up his sleeves, ladled soup, fixed a broken chair, and checked the stock of donated blankets. His hands, rough from labor, were gentle as he helped a young boy with his homework, while Sophie passed out bread, with the cheerful energy only an 8-year-old could bring. When the rush slowed, Sophie sat beside him and asked why the rich never helped. Ethan wiped his brow and answered softly that some people forget what matters. He told her that their job was not to be bitter, but to remember. They gave what they could, and that was enough. His words carried a quiet conviction that contrasted sharply with the greed that had filled the boardroom that morning. The storm had not yet arrived, but the fault lines were clear. Richard's ambition was racing forward. Madison's indifference left the company blind, and Ethan's warning about the failing generators was ignored. In the glow of the shelter's old lamps, surrounded by people who depended on him, Ethan knew the fight was coming. He was just one janitor in the corporate tower, but in Riverside, he was the anchor of a community. The clash between those two worlds was no longer a question of if, but when. Rain hammered the city like a relentless drum as the storm roared in from the coast. By 09:30 p.m., the streets of Riverside had turned into rivers, swallowing cars and sweeping trash cans down the current. Lightning split the sky, and with every strike, another block went dark until whole neighborhoods lost power. Madison Cole had left a dinner meeting uptown, irritated at delays, but her irritation turned to panic when her sleek electric car sputtered and died in a flooded underpass. Water rose around the wheels, and the dashboard went black. She gripped the steering wheel, heart racing, before realizing she had no choice but to abandon it. The storm tore at her as she stepped out. Her $800 heels slid on the slick pavement. Her tailored blazer clung to her skin, heavy with rain. The power and polish she carried so easily in boardrooms dissolved under the fury of nature. She was just another figure stumbling in the flood, blinded by sheets of water and the sting of wind. Her phone showed no signal. The streets, once familiar in daylight, felt like a maze of shadows and rushing water. Through the storm, she caught sight of light ahead, not the flicker of street lamps, which were dead, but steady beams sweeping in organized arcs. Flashlights moved like stars in the downpour, voices cutting through the chaos. She moved toward them, drawn by the order in the midst of panic. As she drew closer, she saw tables covered in plastic, radios crackling, volunteers in bright ponchos moving with purpose. It was a command center, not of professionals, but of neighbors, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Walker. He was not hunched over a mop or retreating under laughter. He stood tall, issuing clear instructions with a voice that carried through the storm. Teams were dispatched to check apartments. Supplies were cataloged and distributed. When someone shouted about an elderly woman trapped in her building, Ethan immediately reorganized the teams, making sure no block was left uncovered. He spoke every name, knew every face, remembered every need. The same scarred hands that once gripped a mop now pointed out search zones and tightened ropes on rescue gear. Madison stopped under the shelter of the entryway, drenched, shivering, her breath ragged. She watched him move through the chaos like a man who had been preparing for this moment all his life. Fear still twisted in her chest, but awe threaded through it now. The janitor she had mocked was no longer invisible. In the storm's fury, he was revealed as something far greater, a leader when leadership mattered most. 2 days after the storm, Madison Cole found herself driving back into Riverside. She had not told her assistant, her driver, or anyone else. For the first time in years, she wore jeans and an old sweater instead of a power suit. The neighborhood still carried scars of the flood, sandbags stacked at corners, broken windows boarded up. Yet Riverside Haven glowed with life. Inside, she heard laughter mixed with the hum of tools. Ethan Walker stood at the center of a group of teenagers, showing them how to test wiring safely. His sleeves were rolled up, his movements patient, his voice calm as he guided a boy through fixing a faulty connection. The students cheered when the light flicked on. Madison paused in the doorway, struck by the contrast. At Brighton Innovations, she commanded obedience with sharp words and charts. Here, Ethan guided with patience and earned respect without demanding it. When the lesson ended, Madison stepped forward. Her voice was hesitant, unused to humility. She told him that Riverside Haven sat directly in the footprint of the Innovation Hub project. She admitted that it would be destroyed unless something changed. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her carefully. He did not show anger or gratitude, only measured patience. She asked what it would take to save the shelter. Ethan leaned back against the table, his expression steady. Real relocation, he explained, meant more than eviction checks and bus tickets. Families needed comparable housing, not temporary motels. Parents needed jobs near schools that would not be torn apart mid-year. Children needed stability, dignity, not displacement. His words carried weight because they were not theoretical. They came from the faces in the next room, from the lives he had carried through the flood. Madison listened, arms crossed at first, then loosening as his quiet truth cut deeper than any quarterly report ever had. She realized this was not a legal issue to be negotiated. It was a moral one. For the first time, she felt the weight of her signature, not as a business act, but as a weapon that could destroy or preserve lives. She thanked him awkwardly, but Ethan simply nodded. He had no interest in corporate apologies. As she walked back to her car, Madison felt conflicted. She was a woman who had built her life on control, yet for once she was shaken. The storm had revealed a side of Ethan she could not ignore. He was more than a janitor. He was a leader who carried the respect of an entire community. The plan for Riverside was no longer just a project on paper. It was a test of who she was willing to become. She drove away with the uneasy knowledge that an alliance with him might be the only way forward, and that she was not sure if she was ready for what it demanded. At 10:00 a.m., the board of Brighton Innovations gathered around the long glass table, city skyline stretching behind them like a stage. Richard Hale stood with the confidence of a man convinced the outcome was already written. He laid out charts of projected growth, glossy renderings of gleaming towers rising over Riverside Block, and figures that promised 300% return on investment. He spoke of legacy and progress, his voice smooth, every sentence dripping with certainty. When Madison Cole hesitated over the papers placed before her, he leaned in and told her it was time to sign. She looked down at the demolition orders, pen in hand. But the faces she had seen at Riverside Haven rose before her eyes. Mothers clutching children in the dark, volunteers moving with discipline while the city drowned, Ethan Walker's calm voice carrying over the storm. She set the pen down. She told the board she would not sign until she had reviewed the community impact. Murmurs spread across the room. Richard's smile twisted into disdain. He mocked her hesitation, telling the board that compassion had no place on a balance sheet, that weakness invited competitors to strike. His words drew a few nervous chuckles, but also unease. Madison straightened in her chair. For the first time, she spoke not as the cold executive they knew, but as someone changed by what she had witnessed. She revealed that the meeting was being live-streamed to the public. A screen lit up, showing thousands of viewers watching in real time. Richard froze, the smug ease slipping from his face. Madison then introduced her alternative proposal: innovation with dignity. She displayed photos from the storm, Riverside Haven glowing in the darkness, children gathered safely while Ethan directed rescues. She showed that the same neighborhood targeted for demolition had been the lifeline when the city failed. The room grew tense. Some board members shifted uncomfortably as comments from the live stream flooded in, siding with Madison's vision. She spoke of reducing the footprint, integrating affordable housing, and preserving the community shelter that had saved lives. It was not just a business plan, but a moral stand. Richard snapped back, insisting investors would never tolerate such cuts. But his voice no longer carried the same weight. For the first time, the board was divided, unsettled. Caught between profit and conscience, the meeting ended without a decision. But the battle lines were drawn. Richard's glare made clear he was not finished, and Madison knew his counterattack was coming. The tension in the air promised that the true fight was only beginning. A year after the storm, Riverside looked nothing like the neighborhood that had nearly been erased. The new innovation hub towered with glass and steel, but between the buildings stood gardens, playgrounds, and a renovated Riverside Haven that had become the heart of the community. Families filled the sidewalks, children laughed as they left after school programs, and small shops thrived where boarded-up windows once stood. The development was no longer a monument to profit, but a living partnership between business and people. Ethan Walker walked those same streets each evening, still carrying the quiet strength that had anchored the neighborhood in its darkest hour. He had refused promotions that would distance him from the life he knew. Instead, he kept a part-time shift as janitor at Brighton Innovations, saying the work reminded him where he came from. At the same time, he served as community liaison, sitting in meetings to make sure Riverside's voices never went unheard. He moved between two worlds with ease, respected in both, never letting recognition change who he was. Madison Cole had changed in her own way. She no longer strode into boardrooms wrapped in armor. The storm had stripped that from her, and she had chosen not to put it back on. She still led with confidence, but she also spent weekends volunteering at the shelter, her sleeves rolled up, serving food alongside Sophie. The press who once photographed her in power suits now captured her laughing with children, a different kind of strength shining through. Sophie had grown taller in the past year, her curiosity sharper than ever. At 10 years old, she carried a wisdom far beyond her age, telling new volunteers why Riverside Haven mattered. She called Madison Aunt Mattie without hesitation, the title spoken with affection that surprised Madison the first time she heard it, but soon became natural. One afternoon, during a community event, Sophie ran into Madison's arms, and Madison knelt in the middle of the crowd to hug her tightly. A photographer caught the moment, the billionaire CEO kneeling to embrace a janitor's daughter, and the image spread across the city as a symbol of two worlds finally meeting. Inside the renovated community center, a corner display drew the attention of visitors. Ethan's old mop and bucket stood behind glass with a small plaque that read, "True leaders serve." Ethan shook his head whenever he passed it, embarrassed at the attention. But Madison told him it was not embarrassing. It was the truth. The tool that once marked him as invisible now stood as proof that dignity and service could change the course of lives. As the sun set over Riverside, Madison, Ethan, and Sophie walked together through the learning lab where children tapped on donated laptops, discovering skills that might one day land them jobs in the very towers rising above them. Their steps slowed as they watched, the three of them united not by title or wealth, but by choice. The city lights reflected in the windows, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything, and how much stronger they had become by choosing another path. The storm that had nearly broken the city had instead rebuilt it with compassion as its foundation. The people of Riverside thrived because one man refused to forget what mattered. One woman found the courage to change, and one child reminded them both that warmth was how you fought the darkness. Together they proved that courage and kindness could reshape not only a company, but an entire community. And in that unity, hope for the future burned brighter than any tower on the skyline.